Hello and welcome back to another Walking Dead video, and today I'll be ranking the top 10 best episodes in 2023. And this year's been quite a packed year. We've had 3 different shows come out: Fear the Walking Dead Season 8, Dead City Season 1, and Daryl Dixon Season 1. So if you're a Walking Dead fan, this is a good year for you, some might say. But let's jump right into this with the top 10 best episodes. So number 10 for me is Dead City Season 1, Episode 4. This episode has a lot of strengths. I really like the Croad. The fight scene is very cool. And I liked what they did with Negan. However, I disliked the way this show looks. And this episode I feel like is the most egregious. I hate the blue neon tint. This episode is just too dark at times, and I feel like this episode just exists to kill off a lot of the extended cast, and characters don't get killed off. It seems very improbable how they survived. I just cannot justify having it any higher, so it sits comfortably in 10th place. Moving on to number 9, and this is Fear the Walking Dead Season 8 Episode 12, and this might be a bit controversial, but I personally really enjoy this episode, and it's shocking because I hated absolutely every episode from the back half of Fear. I thought they were all terrible, but this episode was good, and I think it's because of they actually surprised me. Fear the Walking Dead ended relatively good for a terrible show it was. I liked the ending. It was a nice conclusion. Every character got a satisfying ending to their stories, and it wasn't like all the other spin-offs we've had where they've ended and it's about setting up something. This show is about saying goodbye, and they brought back Alicia for this episode, and this episode was just really enjoyable from start to finish. There were some issues here and there, but with this episode, it just worked. And it's a shame that the rest of the episodes in the back half were absolute trash, but this episode surprised me, so it deserves number 9. And moving up to number 8, I have Dead City Season 1 Episode 6, the season finale for Dead City. And I was shocked with this episode. I really disliked episode 5, that's on my top 10 worst episodes. But then you had this episode, which had that cool Maggie and Negan fight. And this episode really paints Maggie as the villain. Like, that's my biggest issue. And the Croad gets, like, kind of sidelined. But with Negan, that's the most interesting stuff. And they set up the setup for this episode for season 2 is absolutely amazing, with Negan now being the guy who has to slip in to Savior Negan again to reunite Manhattan. This episode is not a big action-packed episode, but is a great ending point for season 1, with Maggie's original quest to save Herschel being completed. And then you have the amazing setup for season 2 with Negan now on this new quest to go and create an army against Percy's people. Moving on to number 7, Daryl Dixon Season 1 Episode 4. And this is still a great episode. However, I feel like this is the weakest in Daryl Dixon for the sole reason of them. It felt like they were stretching out the story a little. They didn't really know what they were doing. It's right in the center of the season, and it's really the most filler. LaRon gets stolen, and the premise is that Daryl and Isabel have to team up after arguing to go and save LaRon. And that's the whole point of this episode. There are some scenes in this episode, there's some cool fight scenes, especially at the bottom of the Eiffel Tower, but I feel like this episode really lets me down with Quinn. I later liked Quinn, but Quinn in this episode did slightly annoy me, and I disliked the ending. I didn't understand why no one else went with Daryl and LaRon. It really felt like they're like, okay, we're going to make this like The Last of Us. Daryl and LaRon have to be alone. Why didn't Sylvie? Because in episode 5, Sylvie's suddenly where Daryl is. Why didn't Sylvie and all those people go with Daryl? Why did Isabel have to stay behind? This episode is definitely the weakest out of them all, but it's still a pretty strong episode. Moving up to number 6, and we have Daryl Dixon Season 1 Episode 3. And this episode is only just slightly better than Episode 4, but I prefer this one more just because it's the first time we see Paris, and we have that really cool start with Daryl's, like, side quest that didn't go right, and you get the crazy walkabout. But once you're in Paris, I really love the first time we see Paris, and it's absolutely amazing. We get to see all these cool locations, see the nightclub for the first time, and we get introduced to all these other cool characters. The downside of this episode is I feel like it ends a bit too abruptly, and I dislike the Daryl and Coach fight, with Coach losing yet again. Up next, number 5, Fear the Walking Dead Season 8 Episode 4. This might be controversial, have a Fear episode this high, But I absolutely love this episode. And that's because I'm a massive Morgan fan. If you're a Morgan fan, you will love this episode because it just finishes off Morgan's 13-year arc that started in season 1 of The Walking Dead, episode 1, back in 2010. This episode closes that off. We go back to King County. We get all these references to episode 1 of The Walking Dead with Rick Grimes, the locations. It's amazing, this episode is. I really like the sets. Lenny James is at point with his acting in this episode. We get to see this Dwayne Walker. This episode, as a massive Morgan fan, is just absolutely amazing. It just really finishes off the story. And I really like when you get a satisfying ending to a character story and it sets up Morgan being able to move on with his new family. And it really helps complete Morgan for me. So even though Fear the Walking Dead's final season is quite bad, I just have to give credit to some of the gems in that season. And this is the gem. This episode is easily one of my favourite episodes of Fear the Walking Dead. Moving on to number 4, Daryl Dixon, Season 1, Episode 6. And this episode starts off absolutely amazing with an epic variant Daryl Walker fight. And the variants being these fast, strong, having toxic blood. And they're aggressive to all other walkers. That is just so amazing. And it is just, wow. The one downside of it, Daryl does feel a bit invincible in this episode, and I dislike the Codron resolution in this episode. That's what really brings this down. Codron meaning with Daryl, there's no fear because Daryl's always beating Codron. Codron's never won, and then he turns on them and just goes back and sets up season 2, which really does suck. Daryl Dixon and Isabel relationship is also teased a little more, which does annoy me. However, we get to see the nest. It looks amazing. And the setup for season 2 is fantastic, with Daryl being torn between staying in France with his new family or going back to find his old family, while back in America, Carol is going to France to try and find Daryl. This is a great ending for an almost perfect season. Moving on to number 3, and I have Daryl Dixon, season 1, episode 2. And this episode is filler, but it's filler done right. This episode has this really, really cool flashback to the fall of France, but the downside is I wanted more of that. It's just a shame we didn't get a full Isabel episode where it focuses solely on her, and I think that would have been a better episode. Outside of the Isabel flashbacks, which are the strongest part of this episode, we get a very interesting story with Daryl and everyone meeting up with this new group. And Daryl has to go on a side quest to go off and try and get food and medicine for all these children. And he ends up running into another American at this castle. We get some really cool action, but I feel it just gets in the way a little of what we actually really want to see, the fall of France. They should have done something with this episode to make the two plots maybe interlink a little more. Also, with the Isabel plot right at the end, we see how Laurent's special, and it is ripped straight out of The Last of Us. It is basically copy and pasted, which does put it down a little in my opinion. Moving on to number 2 is Daryl Dixon, Season 1, Episode 1. And this is the perfect way to start a show. You have all this intrigue and mystery. The show looks amazing. Burner walkers, and this is where I feel like one of the only times in the show where Daryl does feel vulnerable. When he comes up against the burners for the first time, they actually almost kill him, and the first people he meet almost kill him too. Daryl's only saved by Isabel, and it's the only time where Daryl actually feels weak and he's a bit confused and stuff like that. I really like this episode. It's paced amazing, and I would say the only issue with this episode is Laurent in episode 1 is annoying. I disliked Laurent. He does some really stupid things in this episode. It's not carried on throughout the season. It's very weird, but this episode is a great start off to this amazing show, and it is just this mystery box machine. How did Daryl get to France? Why is Laurent special? And all these things get built onto each other to just grip you in, so it has to be here in second place. And now moving on to number 1, and it has to be Daryl Dixon Season 1, Episode 5. This episode is just absolutely perfect in my opinion. We get these cool Daryl flashbacks of how he got to France, and it's a very satisfying reason. We get to see some more variants, and that's this big win in this episode. We get to see in the flashback Daryl's first encounter with a variant runner, and we get to see Daryl's encounter with the mega variant at the end of this episode. The weak points of this episode, I would have to say, is maybe near the middle, and it's only a slight weak point, and that's because I feel like Daryl and Ron's relationship isn't fully developed enough and happened too much off screen. But what we do see is still good. It's a very entertaining episode, and once we get everyone to the castle, the build-up with Madame Genet's speech and Daryl in the arena and that variant walker is just absolutely amazing. This episode is gripping from start to finish and has literally only one flaw. So that's why it is easily the best episode by far in 2023. But remember, this is just my list. So if you disagree with me, I'd like to know all your thoughts and opinions down below. What are your top 10 favourite episodes of 2023? Tell me down below. I'd love to know what your thoughts and opinions are. But this is it for me today, so make sure to like and subscribe to keep up to date with all things Walking Dead. So goodbye, peace out, and I'll see you in my next video.